All right, well, the first thing we're going to be discussing today is the idea. Where does the idea for not just murder, but for crowd murder stem from? We know that it comes into the mind as a thought. It grabs a hold of the mind. It somehow entertains it enough to keep it around in there. You have to remember that the human mind is two things. First of all, it's a sponge. Secondly, it's a file cabinet. It absorbs everything that it possibly can, and then it stores it away. From the crib to the grave. As a child, as an infant, we learn through ideas that are planted into our mind by our mother, our father, whoever is raising us. They put ideas into our head, and then these ideas become the mechanics for our life. We're taught how to ride a bike. We're taught how to read. We're taught how to speak. We're taught how to walk. Once we find our legs, where we just want to just take off and explore the world. Once we find our speech, we're able to compete and argue with our siblings and make demands and get attention, cry when we're hungry, cry when we're ready to sleep, cry when we want to be held. So where does the idea for murder, and not just murder, but crowd murder, stem from? You have to remember that as human beings, when we are born, we are not taught kids are not taught how to steal cookies. They already know how to steal cookies. We teach them how to not steal. We teach them how to not lie. We teach them how to not be a bad person, how to not be a bad human being. So when we see these kids that come on scene, who most of them have never even been in a fist fight, how they go from being a round peg, social misfits, trying to fit in a square hole called life. They're unable to do it. A little bit of weirdness to them, some narcissism, and things like that. But there is an original point. You had to remember, all evil has its source. And I don't want this to become a discussion between good and bad, right and wrong, evil and good. Because if Satan is the one that's causing all this, and the devil is the problem, then God has to be the solution. And Lord knows, in this nation right now, you cannot talk about God, you cannot talk about the devil without having a clash. You cannot talk about black or white without having a clash. You cannot talk about so many things without clashing. So it is with crowd murders. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody has an understanding of crowd murder. Everybody has their conjecture. So I'm not here to argue, debate, or even add to anybody's understanding of crowd murder. All I'm simply here to discuss with you, those that will take the time to listen to this, is how I perceive it. Coming from my mind, a mind that was involved in criminal activity for a number of years. So we're just going to start. We're just going to go ahead and jump in feet first. In the human mind, you can tell I'm not an artist. In the human mind, all right, we have what's called a brain. This brain. In this brain is a reservoir of storage. We store things. Things come into this mind of ours through our ears, through our eyes, through our smell, through our taste. So where does the thought and the idea for murder come from? And not just murder, but crowd murder. You have to remember that the thing that most experts are trying to discover right now, one of the things that most experts are trying to grab a hold of is, and we're not being very successful at it, is we're all trying to find motive. What is the motive? What is the motive for these kids and these men to do what they're doing? What is the motive? What's pushing these demon seeds to do the things that they're doing? Walking into unprotected schools, walking into soft targets, opening fire with assault rifles and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, armor-piercing ammunition. How do they get to that point and that commitment in their life where they can just walk in unchallenged and unfazed and do this, open fire? Now you have to remember that motive, everything that these kids and these men are doing, if we just spend all our time trying to find motive, heaven help us, because if we ever get to the point where we say, this is the motive, this is the reason why. Oh, we found he had a rough upbringing. He was molested as a child. He was a social misfit. He didn't fit in. Girls rejected him in high school. He never played on the volleyball team. He never played on the basketball team. He went on a camping trip with the Sunday with the church group, and the pastor molested him or touched him wrong or whatever the case is. If we ever get to a point where we say, well, this is it, and this is it, be careful. Because what you're doing there is now everybody, when one of these murders takes place, one of these crowd killings takes place, the first thing post-killing reporters do is they drone on and on and on and on and on. And eventually these kids that are out there, these killers that are in waiting, these killers that are lying in wait in their lairs, these killers that have already got the idea to murder and are now just sitting along and just progressing along, when they start adding reason and giving these guys motive, these guys are going to start saying, hey, I can identify with that. Hey, that's me. Hey, I know that feeling. Hey, that's reason for me to kill too. And before you know it, instead of having 30 lunatics posed ready to come on scene and open fire and kill a bunch of innocent people, now you've got 300. Now you've got 3,000. Now you've got 300,000. Let me just share something with you. These kids, these boys, these young boys that have never been in a fist fight, these young boys do not have the post-traumatic stress disorder that a lot of these, they haven't lost their limbs and their legs in the deserts of Iraq or Afghanistan. They haven't gone over there and watched their buddies get blown to pieces by IEDs planted in the roads they were traveling on. These kids are not doing this because they're trying to remedy a childhood pain, and I understand there's childhood pain. But the motive that we're searching for that remains so elusive, it's not there. And the reason it's not there is because we're looking in the wrong spots for it. Where does the idea, the original idea for this, come into that brain? You have to remember that all evil has a source. All evil has a start point. And then it progresses along. All acts of violence have a start point. A start point. There's a start where this idea was introduced into this individual's brain, and then it progressed along to a timeline. And then it finally got to a point where you now have an act of violence. And not just an act of violence, but an act of extreme violence. This timeline sometimes, with all of its influence, sometimes it could take 2 weeks. Sometimes it could take 2 months. Sometimes it could take 2 years. Sometimes it could take 2 decades. We just don't know. We just don't know. But what happens is that somewhere back in here, this idea to murder, this idea to kill, was placed into the mind of this individual, put into his mind. It is a seed of violence. You have to understand, it is a seed of violence. Just like, this is a seed of violence. This seed of violence progresses along, planted into the soil of this individual's brain. Things come along that influence. Might be a broken heart from a girlfriend. Might be a high school bully. Might be a parent, divorce, beat him, an abusive father. It might just be so many different things that came along that continue to influence and nurture and cause this seed of violence to grow. Violent children that were beat as children become violent parents who beat their children. That's what I'm told. My father beat me till I couldn't walk. Beat me almost to death on several occasions. Great father, good man, loved him to death and everything. But he only gave to me what was given to him by his parents. And so it is here. We have this seed of violence that's planted and so many influences to nurture this thing until the point of final commitment where they commit to an act of extreme violence. And that act of extreme violence may be just beating somebody to death, killing a child, baby shaking, or it may be an act of actually arming up, suiting up, and going after the innocent. We just don't know. So the first thing we need to do is we need to stop searching for motive, because we're trying to figure this thing out with decades old textbooks, and I'm telling you the truth when I tell you this. You will never find motive. Not motive to explain. There is not that much hatred in a person's life, especially a young individual, 19 to 27, who has never really experienced hardship. In this generation of enablement, entitlement, where our kids think that, oh, they're just entitled to everything that we can possibly give them, they sit back with open hands, and in those open hands, when we don't cave into them and give them what they want, they become angry, they become resentful, they become hateful. And that hatred and that resentment will begin to build. It will begin to grow. And as it grows, it festers. And if they have an idea to kill, which was planted back here at the start, it will fester that idea along, especially every time somebody rises up and kills, because that idea is already in their head. So every time someone rises up and kills the unprotected, and kills them in a school environment or in a workplace environment, these cowards, these people that have this idea running around in that head, have that idea already themselves, it will just grow. They'll have something to agree with, and there's nothing more stronger than agreement. They'll have agreement. They'll be able to say, oh man, I feel this guy's pain. Now I know why he killed like he did. I feel it. I'm going through the same thing. I feel this guy's pain. And then they talk about his rough childhood. He was a social misfit. The cheerleaders never talked to him. He was always picked last for the football team or whatever. And these guys that are watching these as the reporters drone on post killing with all the reasons why and all these answers that they come up with, because you have to remember that every time there's a crowd killing, the reporters want to be the first one to prove motive. They want to be the first one to find out why this guy flipped out and did what he did. And as soon as they start putting together something that really sounds tangible, because they found out that, hey, this guy had a lot of little nooks and crannies in his past. He didn't have that perfect butter slick life that everybody else, is living in gated communities. And then, he had a rough upbringing. He was in the ghetto, well, not really the ghetto, but, he was had a rough upbringing. Didn't really have a silver spoon in hand. And so they begin to put stuff into these other people, into the live killer who's in training, who's still in hiding, who's still thinking about stuff. And they begin to encourage this. And they encourage it by adding to this idea for murder. They keep saying, this guy had, he had this wrong with his life, so that was why he killed. He had this wrong with his life, that's why he killed. Social misfit, on and on and on. And the guy that's sitting at home in his living room watching this go on, droning on and on and on, day after day, week after week, after a killing, is able to say, wow, that's going on in my life. That's what's happening to me. Now I understand why I'm feeling this way. Now I'm understanding why I'm thinking this way. I thought I was just alone. But no, this dead killer, his life, his decisions, his mechanics to prove that, hey, he had a voice in the world after all, I can identify with that. So before you know it, guess what? He's encouraged that much farther along the timeline. He's getting closer and closer to the day. He was here, but since this new killer came on scene, now he's just progressed a little bit farther, a little bit closer. And for long, he's now picking a target, a soft target, and he's now picking a time. So as they progress along, we need to understand that the idea to commit crowd murder is planted in there somewhere, as far back as the crib, and then nurtured along to a point of harvest, a harvest of violence. Where do these ideas come from? A lot of people say, well, it's the games, it's all those games that these kids play. No, the games are just some of the ingredients. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. Why don't we get ahead of myself? The ingredients that are needed to commit murder and crowd murder. I don't want to focus just on murder. I want to focus on crowd murder, because I have an understanding here that we're missing something here. And I want to point it out so that the people, not the experts, I'm sure I'm going to piss everybody off with all this thinking that I have. But I'm going to tell you something. I've been there. I've stood where these guys stood. That's all I can really say on it. I don't want to go into a whole lot of details, because there's stuff out there that could still get me killed, still get me put in prison. I'm not an angel. Oh my God, if you think you're going to stand here and I'm telling you how smart I am, I went to this college. The only college I went to was Penn State. Oh wait, no, it was a state Penn. I've done federal time, I've done state time. I learned my lessons through the School of Hard Knocks, through hands-on experience. You can sit on the shoreline and look out over the ocean, and 10 miles offshore, you see a raging storm. And you say, man, that's a storm. Look at the size of those waves. Look at all that lightning crashing 10 miles out. That's a storm. Horizon's dark. That's a storm. But if you're in the middle of that storm in a 10-foot aluminum rowboat, and you're rowing for your life, and you're in 40-foot swells, and lightning is crackling just all around you, and the wind is blowing at 40 miles an hour, and you're almost being capsized, and you're rowing along, and you're saying, man, this is a storm. Let me ask you, who's the expert? The one standing on the shoreline safely with his bare feet in the sand, looking out with his hands in his pockets saying, man, that's a storm. Or the guy that's in the rowboat fighting for his life. I have fought for my life in extreme acts of violence. I've had to fight for my life when I went to prison. I've had to do things I'm not proud of to stay alive and return back to my family. That's why I'm doing this now. That's why I'm doing this now. I'm trying to get a point across that there are ideas out there in the minds of people that are festering and being matured and being nurtured along to a point of an act of extreme violence. For every murder that comes unseen and is killed or caught, there are no less than 30 to 70 in training. Live killers that are still waiting for their scene, for their step onto the stage. I'm going to take a break and see if I'm doing this right, but I'll get right back.